Today I'm going to show you how I made a track that got signed to Glasgow Underground and went on to hit the top 10 on Beatport. So if you're interested in how to do that, stick around. Hey guys, Dilby here. Welcome back to the channel. Today I've got an awesome video for you and we're going to be walking through my new track, Remember Me, on Glasgow Underground. As of recording, it's been out for almost 1 week and it's currently sitting at number 7 in the Deep House charts on Beatport. I'm stoked with this result. Let's hope that it's still going up. So if you've heard the track, you've probably noticed that it's using a well-known sample. In fact, it's classified as a cover version. I'm not an expert on the legalities of sampling, but I know there's going to be a lot of questions about that in the comments. So I'm just going to try and address them what I can right now. I did the track, I sent it to Glasgow Underground, and they liked it. To avoid needing permission to use the master right, we had it re-sung. My track has been registered as a cover version, and all of the publishing goes to the original artists. If you check the credits for the song on Spotify, you'll see that the written by section credits the original artists and Dilby is the performer of the track, as it's a cover version. So this track started life a couple of years ago. I made it as a quick edit or bootleg to play in my sets. It worked really well. I sent it to Glasgow Underground, they liked it. We were going to release it, it was scheduled for release in 2020, and then the pandemic happened. I think it was scheduled for like April in 2020, and we really didn't know what was going on. So we put that project on ice, and then at the end of last year, the guys from Glasgow contacted me, and we agreed that it was probably a good time to put it out this summer. If you check out the description of this video, I'm giving away a sample pack. It's almost 600 megabytes, and it's made up from samples and loops from some of my biggest tracks. These are like bass lines, melodies, drum loops, MIDI, all sorts of great stuff. All you've got to do is buy a copy of Remember Me on Beatport and email me your receipt. All the info is in the description. Well, enough of that. Let's jump into Ableton. Alright guys, so here we are inside Ableton and this is the project for Remember Me. So what I'll do is break down some of the elements of the project and kind of how I made them, how it came to be, and I'll also talk a bit about the arrangement and a bit about the concept behind the project, right? So first of all, the concept. The way these kind of tracks, like these heavily sampled tracks or these cover versions or remixes or whatever come together for me, I have like an idea of something that I want for my DJ sets, right? That's how this came to be. Basically, I started playing it was really cool, and I thought, maybe this can be a release. Let's see. And this is reflected in the production. You'll see as I go through, it's pretty simple. It's not overproduced, even though it kind of sounds full and sounds like there's plenty of stuff going on. And I think there's a lesson in that I try to keep in mind myself. It's not necessarily about the craziest production techniques, analog versus digital, hardware versus software, any of that kind of stuff. It genuinely comes down to, is it a good idea and is it executed well? Because when I was making this, I was never actually intending for it to be a release. I wasn't overthinking anything. I was literally doing it with like a functional mindset. I want this thing for my DJ sets and I want to create it as quickly as possible. And I know from my experience, generally the tracks that are made in this way, whether it's a cover version, a remix, or an original idea, the tracks that are made in this way, where you just kind of get out of your own way, you don't overthink things, you do it quickly, they end up being the strongest. They end up being the most successful. And this is what I try to do now when I'm producing all of my tracks. I try to produce them in this way, quickly, without overthinking. If it's a good idea, it works out well. If it's not, move on to the next one. Anyway, enough of the pep talk. Let's actually get in there under the hood and see how this thing ticks. We'll start with the drums. The drums in this are very simple. First of all, we'll look at the kick. It's super simple, just a kick. This is one that I use quite frequently. Nice and deep, solid sounding, a bit of a click so it cuts through. The only thing to really speak of here is in the EQ. I've cut out a little bit here at 215 Hertz. It's actually quite a bit, it's 4 dB. That's maybe a little bit excessive, but what I'm trying to do here is take out a little bit of the boxiness. So if I remove this and then play it with, to me, it just sounds a little bit tighter. This is a tip that I learned from a really good mastering engineer. There was some feedback that I was given on a few different tracks, so I started kind of messing around with this. I don't just do it by default. I don't really operate with any mixing rules, something that I have to do every time to every element or anything like that. I do it in a problem-solving kind of method. I use the techniques that I have available to me to address problems. And in this case, I felt the kick worked really well for the track, but it could be a little bit tighter. Then all I've got here is a filter rack, which is cutting out some of the lows, just creating these little breaks. And then So let's take a look at the claps. There's only one clap in this, super simple. Kind of a snare, really. I'm just cutting out some of the body of that, and then I've got my standard clap plate coming from Verb Suite Classics from Slate Digital. So that reverb really helps to just sit it in a space and make it feel big. You'll notice I'm cutting out quite a bit of the low mids on the clap snare. I do this quite a bit because the kick is providing that kind of low mid, and it allows me to push the clap a little bit louder, have it a bit more audible without triggering the limiter in that position. Hats, super simple here. I've got an open hat. I've got a little bit of velocity randomization happening here, and also a little bit of pan randomization. So this just helps to make the hat feel like it's kind of changing a little bit. Each time the velocity is different, it's going to be a slightly different volume, and each time that the hat is played, it's going to be slightly left or right in the panorama. This just helps to kind of create some movement so it's not so 100% robotic sounding. And I'm just cutting out some of the low mids and a little bit of the highs, because I've got some other things here which are occupying those high frequencies. So with this kind of thing, I really aim to not take away too much from the hat. I'd rather have a strong sample that's the right sample for the track than something that I've got to really heavily EQ. So these three elements together, really strong foundation, and I think this is really important to have like these very basic foundational elements of like a house or techno track to be super strong and working well together. When I start a track, this is the first thing that I work on, searching for these kind of 3 or 4 foundational elements and creating this really simple groove that works well together. And I think if you've got a foundation like that that sounds good and you can listen to it and be interested, then you're off to a great start. So up next, we've got a top loop. I color the clips differently to give me a visual representation that something different is happening, some kind of automation or something. So here, I'm automating the highs. So this pink clip represents where I've got the highs taken out, and then the red clip is where the highs are in full, or in this case, where this EQ is letting through more highs gradually with this automation. I'm using the glue compressor to control a bit of the dynamics, and then I'm using this erosion to add a bit more body. So by doing things like this, adding the erosion or using overdrive or some kind of saturation, you're able to give the sound more body, allow it to kind of take up more space, and then you avoid the temptation to put more and more loops on top, which I find can really muddy up your mix and kind of confuse the groove. So next up, I've got a shaker loop. And you'll notice that this is kind of 2 sounds playing left and right in the panorama. So it sits really wide. When I play that with the open hat is pretty down the center, and the shakers are really happening on the edges. Combine that with the top loop. And it's starting to sound really full and busy, energetic, but not over the top. So by choosing the right elements that work well and complement each other, you're able to get away with using much less. And this can really make the mix down a breeze. Next, we've got percussion. I've got a bongo loop here. I forget where this is from, but I've used it in a lot of tracks. It just works, so I keep using it. And this is something I do. I reuse things. I drag things from other projects. I'm a big fan of working quickly and getting my ideas down. I can always go back and change things, but it's kind of like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Then I've got another loop here. So that's quite low in the mix, adding some interest and some personality to the drums. Let's play it without, and then I'll bring it in. So that snare underneath that happens on the 4th beat of each bar, It really kind of adds to the groove and adds to the personality. It feels like it's kind of breathing underneath of the rest of the loop. So you'll see by choosing the right sounds and the right loops, you don't need a whole lot. You can get away with much less, which is really going to make your life easy when it comes to mixing. I've kind of worked this into my process of how I produce now. I don't start with the drums really. I'll kind of do those first few main elements, the kick, clap, open hat, throw in a loop, and then go from there. And then I'll put the drums in later. The reason I do this is I want to work on the personality of the track, the melodic elements, the vocal, the bass, the things that give the track some emotion and make it memorable. Then I'll fit the drums around them. I'm not saying that the drums aren't important. They're vitally important. They have to be right. It's kind of mandatory. But what I used to do was make a very intricate drum groove and then try and fit some kind of melodic elements or vocal around that. And so frequently I'd find myself just tearing my hair out, going like, why can't I find anything to fit? Doing it this way, I create a track with more depth melodically, and then I use the drums to kind of emphasize and back that up. So I really recommend giving that approach a try. All right, let's have a look at the bass. So the bass here is made up of 2 layers. We're actually starting with the bass in. What I would normally do is change the color of this to show myself where I've got different sections. But as I said, I made this track super quickly and I kind of didn't go back and do all of this stuff that I would normally do in the mixdown stage. But it is super helpful to have these visual representations to keep track of where you are, what's going on, and where different sections are happening in the track. Same with these markers up the top. Of course, if you're not being lazy, then it's a great idea to also name these. So the sub bass is a sample from my sample pack, Underground Shades of House. Link up here if you want to grab that. Let's take a listen to it. So in terms of processing, I've got a decapitator, adding some saturation, a compressor, just controlling the dynamics a bit, and then I've got this EQ, which is just taking out some of the higher frequencies. And then, of course, an LFO tool to sidechain it to the kick. I'll take off the decapitator and the EQ, and you can hear what's happening. So that's pretty subtle, the EQ. So the EQ is just taking out some of those high frequencies. And the reason I've done that with the EQ is to make room for the second layer. So let's take a quick look at the MIDI. The MIDI is playing over 2 octaves. The key of the track is in G sharp. So having this pattern play over 2 octaves is creating like a really groovy and interesting sound and texture to the bass. It's almost like 2 bass lines playing together. So let's have a quick listen. I'll turn off the lower notes with the kick. Very familiar classic pattern. So let's do that in reverse. So that's being sidechained by the kick. You'll notice that most of those notes are playing on the kick, and it's kind of like reinforcing that groove. So all together, quite a simple yet strong and characterful bass line. I think having those notes playing over 2 octaves really gives a distinct, funky, interesting sound to the bass. Now what I've done with the second bass pluck, I've taken the same notes from the first bass line, put them all onto 1 octave, and then just used these to emphasize specific points of the bass line. So this bass plucks is supposed to sound more like an electric bass guitar. So I think just having this higher layer really helps to make the bass a bit more interesting and give it a bit more personality. So this is a preset from Serum called Bass Ampology. I think it's even the first preset in the Serum bass presets. And I think I've just tweaked this a little bit to sound how I want it. Then I'm using FabFilter Saturn 2 with a bass DI preset, which is like a bass guitar amp. So it's in the guitar section, amps, bass DI. Then I'm using this EQ to cut out some of the subs. I don't need them as they're being played by the sub bass. Let's just hear that. Then I'm using a tight EQ band here at 3.3K just to cut out any upper harmonics that might interfere with the vocal or the hats or anything like that. They're just completely unnecessary for this. and it helps to make it sound a bit tighter. Then I've got my trusty Tel Chorus LX, one of my favorite free plugins, just adding some chorus, giving it a bit of space, a bit of width. You'll notice here I'm using a couple of sends. These are just my standard sends from my template. Link a video up here about my template if you want to check that out. But let's take a quick look. I've got the synth verb, which I use to kind of put all of the melodic elements into a similar space. I've got a ping pong delay, which is set here to dotted eighth notes. So that's just giving the sub bass a little bit of personality. Very, very subtle. And then I've got this wide synth return, which is a bit over the top with EQ, saturation and whatnot. And they're just giving a bit of extra width and saturation. So let's hear the bass plucks with and without that. Very, very subtle. So we're going to skip over the synths for now, and I'll come back to them. I'm going to talk about the vocal as it's kind of the main point of the track, right? So in the intro, I spoke about the vocal, how it all came to be, the legalities of it, all of that kind of thing. So if you missed that, then jump back and check it out. This is going to be more about the production of the vocal. So I've got the main vocal here. This is the replayed audio, comes from a longer stem, and you'll notice here that it's at 101 BPM, which is the re-sing was done at the original tempo, and this really helps to give it the same feel as when it's done with a sample. Sometimes if you get something re-sung, and it's re-sung at the tempo of your project, it can lose the vibe of that original sample. If you had the option to do both, that would be ideal, but I think it can be kind of the safe option to have it re-sung at the original tempo of the sample. So I've broken this down into sections. I've got the gang gang part, this one. And then the remember me part. Remember me. Remember me. And these are both grouped together just for mixing purposes so that I can set the balance of the vocals together and I don't have to do that individually. I can turn up the whole vocal with one knob. So in terms of vocal processing, I've got a bit of EQ here, pumping up a little bit around 2K. And I find that this can really help to push a vocal up in the mix, make it kind of poke through a bit more. A bit of the personality tends to be around this area. But like I said earlier, I don't really mix or produce with any rules. I hear something and I respond to that with, like I hear a problem and I respond to that with a solution. I'm using Little Alter Boy to turn the formant down by 1. And this is just giving it a slight pitched down effect without actually changing the pitch of the sample. Remember me! Remember me! Very subtle, just sounds a little bit deeper. I've got Virtual Mix Rack from Slate Digital, just doing a bit of mixing to the vocal, a little bit of saturation, very, very slight EQ, adding a bit of a boost here at 1.5, a little bit of brightness, and a bit of compression. Remember me! Quite a bit of compression. I've got the Valhalla UB mod at the default setting, 25%, just adding a little bit of width in chorus. Remember me! Remember me! So on this vocal, I've used the LFO tool in the drop to duck the vocal to the kick, and I have felt like this really helped the vocal to gel with the track. It's not something that I would normally do, but in this case, I felt like it worked. And I've got an auto filter that is completely unnecessary on this track, so let's delete it. Then I've got this Vox, Verb, and Delay rack. I'll link a video up here where I go through this in detail. But what I'm doing here is adding parallel vocal processing. So I've got the dry signal coming through here. Remember me! And then if I turn that off, we can hear all of this processing is being added on top of the dry signal. Then the magic thing about this rack, most of these things like the reverb and the delay are being ducked by the dry signal. So you get like this big reverb feel, this big kind of epic vocal sound, but it's being ducked to the original vocal, so it doesn't cut out the vocal. It doesn't kind of overwhelm it and swamp it in reverb. So the processing on the gang gang part is very similar, or the same pretty much. I think I just duplicated the channel to separate them and make it a bit more easy to understand for myself what's going on. In this case, I am using the EQ to just ease this vocal in the break. Then I've got this vocal pad. which probably could be in the melodic group. It doesn't really sound like a vocal. I've got some decapitator on that. Just kind of adding a bit more presence with some saturation. So then I'm using this Replica XT from Native Instruments with an 1/8 note delay, and I'm just automating the mix to kind of build that up. So this is actually more like a synth riser type element. It's building in these sections and increasing some tension. As always, LFO tool. Next up, I've got this vocal sweep. So this is just an effect sound that I've created myself from the original vocal. So I'll show you quickly how I do that. Create a new audio track, create another new audio track. I'm going to take this part here, which is the Remember Me part, drag it down here. Let's hear it.
Remember me!
Crop that and reverse it. I'm going to add on an Ableton reverb, put that to 100% wet, bring this decay time up to about 12, take off the high cut, and this is what it sounds like. Okay, so then we freeze that track. Then I grab this, hold Control, drag it down to the next track, and we've got this. Now I'm going to bring this in, crop, reverse, turn this one off. So then I could bring this back like here. And on this one, I believe I added some saturation and EQ. There you go. Super easy and effective production technique that you can use to create your own effects. I'll link a video up here where I go through a bunch of different techniques for creating your own effects. It can be really useful to get unique and interesting sounds for your tracks. I've also got this Vox, which is just part of the original sample. So I'm using that to tease in the vocal. People will recognize it. Maybe they can't quite place exactly where it's from, or wonder, is this going to be a Remember Me track? This is a way to create interest and tension for the club, for the dance floor. And I've got another part of the sample which I've just put into a simpler. So that's more of a rhythmic element that's happening with the groove. So I really like to use vocal elements like this in my tracks, kind of like a vocal as some percussion. It just really helps to add some interest and some depth to your beat. I've got a bit of delay on this, some LFO tool, and the smart compressor, which is side-chained to the main vocal group, this one here. And that is basically ducking out any competing frequencies when the main vocal is playing. So let's have a quick look at how that works. So the smart compressor analyzes the input signal and then sidechains competing frequencies from the signal that it's applied to. In this case, the Babe Vox. So in simple terms, the way that I use this is to give space for the most important element. All right, now let's jump into the melodic elements, and there are quite a few. So what I've done is broken it down into these three sections: synths, pads, and one-shots. And all of these sections kind of like work together. The elements work together. So I'm not going to dwell on each one for too long. It's going to be more about the sections. So the first section is the synths, and it sounds like this. So they're working together to make up like a melodic groove, a question and answer type thing. So let's hear those synths together with the bass and the drums. You can hear that they're kind of like a melodic groove. They're making up this kind of backbone of the track, right? They're all working together to be more than the sum of its parts. So let's have a look at some of the individual elements. First up, I've got this synth Hammond. So this is a patch from Omnisphere, Smoked Hammond Club, I'm playing one note in the MIDI, and I'm using this chord device to make it into a minor seventh chord. I've got a filter cutting out some of the highs and a bit of delay to give it some vibe. Let's have a listen. And without the filter. So the filter is really like a mixing kind of thing. It's helping to give space to other elements in the track. This is without the chords. Big difference. Okay, let's have a look at this deep synth stab. So this is just a sample. I'm using the filter on simpler to cut out some of the frequencies and adding some saturation with FabFilter Saturn. So the raw sound, filter, and the Saturn again is just subtle, just helping to beef it up a little bit, cutting out the lows, adding a bit of chorus. So those two together. So then I've got this big chord stab. So this is coming from a loop, and I'm just using one hit of the loop. MIDI looks like this. So this is a big kind of like dub techno-esque kind of chord stab, just adding some reverb onto it and some compression to control the dynamics. And let's have a look at this MIDI all together. If I highlight them like this, you can see them on top of each other. So you can see where they're kind of starting to play off each other. Now, this one, I'm not going to lie to you, I've got no idea how I came up with that melody. I will say it's generally just kind of trial and error, just throwing things in, seeing what will work, hitting some keys on the MIDI keyboard and hearing tones that sound good. I'm not a trained musician, it's just trial and error and effing about. So then I'm using Tantra to basically give it that glitchy kind of sound. So that's kind of cool, but it's lower in the mix. It's really just adding some interest and some depth and personality to the vibe. Now I've got this synth down chord. So these first four elements here are all playing together to create a melodic groove. So a nice call and response happening there. And I've got this synth Rhodes, which is being filtered across the arrangement. And I'm using some decapitator to give it a bit more saturation, and this transient shaper from kilohertz to push up the attack, so take away some of the attack, pull back the sustain to make it not so long. So without that, and this is frozen and flattened. I'm assuming this also came from Omnisphere. I don't quite remember, but it looks like it's part of a longer sample. So this is like just a kind of groovy ear candy part, really. So I'll turn this off, and then we can hear it with and without. So I'm pretty sure this was the last bit that I put in, and it's really kind of filling in the gaps in that question and answer type thing. So together with these other synth parts, it really kind of starts to feel like they're talking amongst themselves and having this conversation. And that's always the vibe that I'm going for with synths. You can kind of do a lot of this with one synth if you want, but I find that breaking it up into across multiple sounds like this really helps to elevate the interest factor of it. Now let's take a look at the pads section. So this is basically just strings and pads. I've got this synth drone, which looks like it's just from a sample. And I'm just automating the volume there to create tension in the arrangement. Synth string, so this is just happening in the break. And what's happening here? It looks like I've got the same sample and I've duplicated it. This one I'm taking away the highs. This one I'm taking away the mids. Let's hear just the highs. And this is being pitched up by 5 semitones. This one's being pitched down by 7 semitones. So here's just the mids. And together. So the reason I've done that is just to fill out the frequency spectrum a bit more. I think I probably tried it one way, it felt too high. I tried it the other way, it felt too low. So I did both. Then I've got an LFO tool, a bit of echo, and this filter, which is just opening up the high frequencies as the break carries on, and this RC20, which is adding some kind of vibe. I'll show you that with and without. So this is really cool. It adds this kind of like automated pitch kind of feel with this wobble and the magnetic. Really cool. Quite subtle, but really nice. Then I've got a high string. This is recorded from a piece of hardware, my Roland JV1010, and this is actually in the sample pack that I'm giving away. There's a link in the description about how you can get that sample pack. So all those pads and strings together. We've got this one-shots section, and as you can see, this is basically built up from samples, right? I've got a synth sweep here. I've got these two twinkle synths, so let's take a listen to them together. And with most of these kind of samples like this, I'll be taking them from a different key or a different tempo or something like that and pitching them to be in the key of the track, and then using some sends or effects on them to help make them a bit different and make them my own, right? And I've got this low drone. More like a growl. If you check out this video here on melodic techno, then I'll show you how you can make things like this. But in this case, as I said, I was working fast, just throwing things in, trying to get the result, trying to get something for my DJ set that weekend. So I wasn't really worried about the process. I was just worried about getting it done and getting it finished. Turned out that it was pretty cool. Then I've got a couple of other synths which just happen in specific sections, and they're just basically adding a bit of interest or a bit of ear candy. So this one is a loop here. So that's kind of working with these synths. But I've put it in this one-shots section because it's only happening in one place. And the same thing applies to this. So that's just adding some extra interest in this place where I've cut out the drums. Okay, now let's have a quick look at the effects. I've got a couple of clap fills, which are not in the percussion section because I don't want them to be filtered in the arrangement in these parts where I'm filtering all of the drums. So I want them to be playing while the rest of the drums are filtered. The easiest way for me to do that was just to move them to a different part of my template. So these sound like this, just to add kind of percussive interest. And I've got this clap fill adding like a bit of a turnaround every 8 bars. And the reason I've frozen this is because it carries on for quite a while. So for the purposes of making the tutorial, it's just easier to have that frozen so I can stop the audio and keep talking. But they're just adding rhythmic interest to the percussion section. I've got a snare fill, snare riser. As you can hear, that's being automated and sent to some big reverb. I've got these dub claps, which is just a clap sent through some reverb and delay. Again, the reason I've frozen it is just so that I can stop it from decaying on so long. So I've got a noise riser here. And the same thing going down. And you can see here that's taken from a longer sample, and I've just chopped it and put one bit here and one bit here. Got another noise effects being sent to some big delay and reverb. I've got some vinyl background, very subtle. This is just from vinyl that I recorded. You can see here the full sample, just using the start there. What I've done is just used the warp feature to drag those crackles onto the 16ths and then applied the same swing that I'm using in the rest of the project, this MPC 57. I've got a crash, big and atmospheric one. I've got this clav with some reverb on it. A noise sweep, just helping transition at the end of these breaks. A timbale delay. And a reverse hat. So quite a few different effects in this track, helping to add tension and release, create moments of impact, and also add some kind of nice atmospheric stuff with some of these percussion delays. Let's talk a little bit about the arrangement. So what I was trying to go for with this track is to have something that is recognizable, has this kind of like wow factor or this kind of nostalgia factor, but isn't quite so obvious. So what I've really tried to do here with the vocals is tease it in and give like some hints as to what it is with the vocal bits that I'm using, but it really isn't until 2.5 minutes into the track where I let it say "Remember Me" or the "gang gang," like the main parts of the vocal. And I've really done this on purpose, held it back so that by the time it happens that there's some kind of tension and release. And I didn't do this originally. You can see here with the vocal arrangement, I've actually had it originally playing quite differently. I had much more of the vocal playing more frequently. But I felt by taking that out, holding it back, and just giving a few teasers, it gave it more longevity. I was really able to work that vocal and get more out of it, get more longevity from it, and get more impact. By the time the actual full vocal plays here, people are really ready to hear that. I've waited till the main break to introduce the gang 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 vocal, and I'm using that to build up tension, kind of work through the break, and then when this "Remember Me" I'm the one who had you, baby. People are so ready to hear that, and for that to have its moment, it creates such an impact and drama in the club. One other notable point that I've done in the arrangement is this part here where I've taken out the drums. And this is basically like a precursor to the break, but it also helps to act as like a bridging section. It changes things up, creates like a dynamic atmosphere on the dance floor. And just doing simple things like this, bringing things in and out of the arrangement, helps to give different elements their moment to shine and also create dynamics in the arrangement, which really helps to stop things being linear. Also, by bringing things out, it gives you the opportunity to bring them back in, which creates excitement. So let's have a quick listen to that part. So So while the kick and bass are still playing here, this is kind of the start of the break. I'm taking energy away from the hats, but I'm giving some of the vocal, which creates a shift in balance and helps to make it interesting. It makes an easier transition into the break, but it still helps to create that tension for the main drop. So as I mentioned in the intro, for the next 2 weeks, I'm giving away a sample pack. This is no ordinary sample pack. This is made up of bits and pieces from some of my biggest tracks. When I say bits and pieces, it's actually almost 600 megabytes. So it's a full sample pack. And it's made up of elements that I've taken from my tracks that I really enjoyed, that I use again and again. This is really my production tools. You can see here in Ableton, I've got it linked, and I use it all the time. It's got MIDI parts, clap fills, snare risers, all sorts of stuff. Bass MIDI from some of my different projects. There's so much in there. If you want to get your hands on it, all you need to do is buy a copy of Remember Me and email me your receipt from Beatport. So if you're interested, all the info is in the description. Enjoy that. Alright guys, I really hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informative for you. Don't forget about the sample pack giveaway. All of the information is in the description. It's a really cool and useful pack, so check it out. If you like this video, well, I've got more like that. This one in particular is how I made my track No More Love on Gorge and Nick Curley's label 8-Bit. Alright guys, well that's it from me today. We'll catch you next time. Peace!